Okay, thank you so much. My name is Himani Upadhyay, and I'm very excited to join you here online. And thank you so much for the organizers to giving me an opportunity to participate here. I'm going to be talking about staying communities, and this is an outcome of my outcome of field research that I did for my PhD. And as you can see, there's a small quote in my presentation which says limited people with limited options. And it came from a 50-year-old farmer who was doing who was affected by both sustained out-migration of people from his village and also impacts of climate change on agriculture. And in distress, and he was very distressed, and he said that our life used to be so much fuller before, but now it has become very limited. And he was referring to the life that he and the people in the village were living. And he said, our life has become very limited and we have very limited options to make it better. I have organized my presentation as follows, and I'll take you along. So as early as 2011, the Foresight report pointed that staying populations are hidden from high-level estimates, yet they represent a policy concern just as serious, if not more serious, than migration. And here we are in 2023, and literature till date fails to build an understanding of how climate change and migration impact staying communities. So for this research, I asked these following questions. That I asked them that what are the different changes that you've been impacted by or you've observed in your communities in the last 10 years. So what are the existing processes of change that are affecting staying communities? And what are the perceived impacts of migration? Like, what do staying communities understand of migration? How does it impact them? And I kind of, discussed this as, is migration good, bad, or necessary? And lastly, that how does migration interact with these processes of change, and what is the cumulative impact on the ability to cope with climate change impacts? So I did this research in the Indian Himalayan region in the state of Uttarakhand in India, which has a population of about 10 million people and has growing out migration, where 40% of the population are migrants, and about from 16,000 villages, about 1,053 villages have no inhabitants due to depopulation, while 405 villages have population of less than 10 people. And 70% of the population in this area depends on agriculture, which is for subsistence, while equally 70% lives in rural areas. Now, migration in this region is a livelihood strategy to diversify income, to adapt to the constraints of rain-fed agriculture, and to meet personal aspirations. I also looked at it from a climate change and migration perspective, and this is a livelihood risk map, which essentially shows that regions in the north where we see more heat, more rain, are also regions from where people are moving, people are out migrating. I did this research across 13 villages, doing 72 interviews, 72 qualitative interviews, and then later analyzed it in Maxquedia. And to start with, that there are different processes of change, like I mentioned, which are affecting these communities. One is increased impact of climate and disasters, such as dry mountain springs, which are the lifeline for water, for drinking water in these villages. There's reduced monsoon rainfall. People say it's hotter than before. It doesn't rain on time. Either it rains too much or too little, and there is increasing intensity of cloud bursts and heavy rainfall events. And all of these impact agriculture and local livelihoods in the region, so much so that people say that we used to be food secure, we used to have food storage, but now we have food shortage. And we are now buying food, which is something not a common practice in these communities. There's reduced agricultural output, where people would refer that I had 40 bags of rice before, but now I'm barely managing 20. There's increased crop diseases and pests. And one of the things that came out very strongly in my interviews was that even though Himalayas are the water towers of the world, people don't have water to drink. So water insecurity is rising. And another process of change which is taking place is migration. So historically, these communities have been migrant sending, but there has been a transition from, say, male mobility to entire family moving out. There's also a transition from temporary to sustained permanent out migration, so much so that villages have become completely depopulated and empty, which has led to abandoned houses and fallow lands. And all this has led to a feminization of agriculture. So one of the impacts of migration is feminization of agriculture. As villages become depopulated, there's less interest from local institutions and government to, invest in basic amenities like schools and hospitals. So these are shutting down. And the social context is also changing, where there is a disruption of social ties due to migration-related separation. There's a declining respect for local culture, especially among the youth. And there are mental health implications of migration, especially among the elderly and the women who are staying behind. And another thing that's happening for the youth is that not everybody who lives in a village wants to be a farmer. So there's a move away, a waning interest in farming, especially in the youth. And this sort of increases the burden for the elderly as people out-migrate. And I also observed that there was a lot of negative emotions for the migrants in these communities, almost anger-filled emotions for the migrants who were leaving the village and not returning. So I asked the staying communities that, what do you think about migration? How does it impact you? Is it good? Or is it bad, or sort of necessary? And as you can say, the majority of the people said that migration is bad, while some said that it's good, it's necessary, it's both good and bad, and while some had really no opinion. So these are the perceptions of migration. When people say migration is good, they refer to the remittances, they refer to the fact that they get opportunity outside of agriculture, that they can acquire new skills. It adds to their household income security and also leads to upward social mobility, which is very important to these communities. Like the quote says, that my son migrated many years ago. He's an engineer and has a good job in Delhi. He sends about 450 euros of money on a regular basis, and this comes in handy. It helped me to marry off 2 daughters, and I use this money to buy food, pay for farm labor, and not everyone in the village has that comfort. There were others who said migration is necessary to adapt to the constraints of rainfed agriculture, because there aren't any employment opportunities other than agriculture in this region. There's a severe lack of development and infrastructure. And then the youth, once you have a basic minimum education, people don't see the reason to stay in the village. They're attracted to the cities. And it also helps to maintain household income, economic security. Like the quote says that, well, if people are educated, they have to migrate. Why will they stay here? There's no opportunity in the village. There's no income. There's no job. An educated person will not pick up cow dung in the village. They would want to go to the city and work. So they quit the rural life. It's also about the status, about the state and what the idea of success is. And those who said migration is bad referred to the fact that there was a decreased labor in agriculture. People were moving away from farm-based labor to wage labor in the cities. There was a loss of community. There was more tasks for women, and the fact that there were abandoned assets, especially fallow lands, which affected those people who were doing agriculture negatively. There were elderly who were living alone, and the fact that there was waning interest from the government and local institutions in investing in infrastructure for those who were staying. And there was a change in the demographic structure and composition of the village. Like I mentioned in the quote, that I have a piece of land which is fertile, well farmed, and now there's another piece of land which is next to mine, which is fallow. As people out-migrate and abandon their land, so now all the rats, pests, and invasive crops will come to my side of the land and spoil my crops. So when people migrate, it is bad for my farming. So in these regions, people do communal farming. So they decide that this is the seed that they have to grow. This is the crop that they want to grow, and they do that collectively. So if one land is lying fallow to one that is still, being used, then it affects those who are doing agriculture. So very shortly, to summarize that. Migration can be a cause for both, is both a cause and consequence for local vulnerabilities, and climate change impacts add to it. So while migration can help meet the economic needs of the household, it does not result in economic development, at least in this region. It fails to have a multiplier effect, especially from remittances. It can lead to crossing of social, economic, and ecological thresholds. In fact, in Uttarakhand, out-migration leads to loss of labor, changing social cultural milieu, a loss of community, affects local institutions, all of which negatively impact communities' ability to cope with and adapt to climate impacts. Now, though migration is discussed as adaptation, it has the potential to be adaptive. It is not predetermined. In this case, we find that migration is unlikely to have success as an adaptive strategy unless development policy can address the underlying causes of vulnerability. Now, in this respect, remittances are often discussed as an alternate source of finance for adaptation. But in this case of Uttarakhand, even though there are high remittances, these are not really leveraged for climate adaptation. In fact, climate adaptation is the last priority of households. They invest their remittances in organizing their everyday life to buy food, to buy clothes, to pay for education of their children. Thirdly, there's limited capacity to adapt for vulnerable groups. So the people who are staying are often more vulnerable, such as elderly people. Where I was doing interviews, they were mostly elderly people who were living alone, or women who are faced with more tasks and burden of both taking care of the family and tasks related to agriculture and rearing of animals. So these groups are more, staying populations could be more vulnerable. So therefore, policy needs to address the needs and priorities of the staying communities in order to maximize the impacts of migration. Otherwise, in order to maximize the positive impact of migration, the voice of staying communities need to be heard and represented in relevant political and policy processes, because if neglected, it can lead to a mobility bias in which the agency needs and rights of people are ignored, of those who are staying are ignored. And lastly, there's not much research on how migration impacts staying communities. So there's a need for more research to understand the nuances and dynamics of how migration impacts staying communities. Thank you.